The Middle East has just witnessed a moment that will echo through military history for decades. A moment that no Pentagon strategist, no defense contractor, engineer, and no Israeli Air Force commander ever wanted to see become reality. In the skies above Lebanon, something once considered nearly impossible has happened. An F-35, I widely regarded as the most advanced stealth fighter ever built, the crown jewel of Western air power, an aircraft designed to be invisible, untouchable, and dominant in any contested airspace, has been shot down. Not damaged, not forced to retreat, but destroyed. Its wreckage now lies scattered across Lebanese terrain, burning, and with it, a long-standing belief in uncontested air superiority has been shaken at its core. The shockwave from this single event did not remain confined to the battlefield. It spread instantly across capitals and command centers. In Tel Aviv, emergency meetings were convened within minutes. In Washington, senior defense officials shifted into crisis management mode as analysts scrambled to understand the implications. Meanwhile, in Tehran and among its regional allies, the reaction was immediate and unrestrained, a celebration of what had long been considered unattainable. For years, adversaries of Western military power had studied, adapted, and searched for vulnerabilities. Now, they appeared to have found one. The F-35 was never just another fighter jet. It represented an entire philosophy of warfare, one built on the assumption that technological superiority could be so overwhelming that it would render traditional defenses obsolete. The logic was simple but powerful. If an aircraft could not be detected, it could not be targeted. If it could not be targeted, it could operate freely. And if it could operate freely, it could impose strategic outcomes without meaningful resistance. This idea justified enormous investments and shaped military doctrines across multiple nations. It became the backbone of modern air power strategy. Israel, in particular, embraced this concept with confidence. Its customized F-35I variant incorporated advanced domestic systems, creating what its military considered the most capable version of the aircraft in existence. These jets operated over contested regions with a level of assurance that bordered on absolute certainty. Previous missions reinforced this belief. There had been no confirmed cases of such aircraft being successfully engaged in sustained combat. That record contributed to a growing perception that stealth had effectively solved the problem of survivability in hostile airspace. The mission that ended in catastrophe did not initially appear unusual. It was a precision strike operation targeting infrastructure linked to Hezbollah in eastern Lebanon. The aircraft was operating within parameters previously considered secure, flying at altitude, supported by sophisticated onboard systems, and piloted by an experienced operator. All standard pre-mission checks had been satisfied. From a planning perspective, the risk profile was acceptable. What planners did not fully account for was a transformation taking place within the opposing air defense network. Over the preceding months, a quiet but significant evolution had been unfolding. Iran, working through regional allies, had been deploying a new kind of integrated detection and engagement system. This was not a single radar installation or missile battery. It was a network, one that combined multiple sensing methods into a unified picture. Individually, each component might not have been sufficient to detect a stealth aircraft reliably, but together, they created something far more powerful. At the heart of this system was the idea of sensor fusion. Instead of relying on one source of information, it gathered data from several imperfect sources and combined them into a coherent whole. Low-frequency radar systems, which are less precise but more capable of detecting stealth shapes, contributed one layer. Passive detection arrays, which track electronic emissions without revealing their own position, added another. Thermal imaging systems observed heat signatures against the background of the atmosphere. Historical flight data and predictive algorithms help estimate likely movement patterns. None of these elements alone would have been enough to produce a precise targeting solution, but together they generated a probabilistic picture. The system did not need to know exactly where the aircraft was at every moment. It only needed to narrow down its possible location to a manageable area and reach a level of confidence sufficient to justify an engagement. Once that threshold was reached, the decision to fire could be made. The missile that ultimately struck the aircraft was part of a new generation of systems designed with this exact challenge in mind. Unlike traditional missiles that rely heavily on continuous radar guidance, this one was supported by offboard data and equipped with a terminal guidance system that did not depend on strong radar emissions. This approach reduced the warning time available to the target. The aircraft's onboard systems, optimized to detect conventional threats, did not receive a clear signal early enough to allow effective countermeasures. By the time the missile entered its final phase, the engagement geometry was already unfavorable. There was little room to maneuver, little time to react. Within moments, the aircraft was lost. The pilot did not survive. Shortly afterward, images began to circulate, showing wreckage scattered across the landscape. For analysts familiar with aviation technology, the identification was unmistakable. Confirmation spread rapidly, faster than any attempt to control the narrative. What makes this event so significant is not simply the loss of a single aircraft. It is what that loss represents. For decades, the concept of stealth has been treated as a near binary condition. Either an aircraft could be detected or it could not. In reality, stealth is far more complex. It depends heavily on frequency, angle, and the capabilities of the detection system. Aircraft like the F-35 are optimized to minimize detection by the types of radar most commonly used for targeting, but that does not make them invisible under all conditions. Lower frequency radar systems, for example, operate with longer wavelengths that interact differently with aircraft surfaces. These systems have historically been less precise, making them unsuitable for guiding weapons. However, when combined with other data sources, their limitations can be mitigated. The result is not perfect clarity, but it does not need to be. Modern computing allows for the integration of multiple data streams, producing a workable solution from imperfect inputs. This is the breakthrough that appears to have been achieved. It is not a single technological leap, but the integration of several existing technologies into a cohesive system. It reflects years of research, adaptation, and learning. It also highlights a critical shift in how air defense is approached. Instead of trying to match stealth with equally advanced radar, the focus has moved toward combining different types of detection in a way that compensates for individual weaknesses. The implications of this shift are profound. Every Air Force that relies on stealth technology must now reconsider its assumptions. The idea that certain aircraft can operate with near impunity in contested environments is no longer secure. Instead, planners must account for the possibility that even the most advanced platforms can be tracked and engaged under the right conditions. Beyond the technical dimension, there is also a psychological impact. Deterrence is not only about capability, but also about perception. The belief that a system cannot be defeated can be as powerful as the system itself. When that belief is broken, the strategic landscape changes. Adversaries who once felt constrained may become more willing to take risks. Allies who relied on certain guarantees may begin to question them. In this case, the symbolic weight of the F-35 amplifies the effect. It has been presented as the pinnacle of modern military technology, a platform that embodies decades of innovation and investment. Its loss challenges that image. It forces a reevaluation. not just of a single aircraft, but of the broader framework within which it operates. As the details continue to emerge, one question dominates discussions in defense circles. How did a nation operating under significant constraints manage to develop and deploy such a capability? The answer lies in persistence and adaptation. Over time, limitations can drive innovation. When direct competition is not possible, alternative approaches are explored. In this case, the focus appears to have been on exploiting gaps rather than matching strengths. This approach has produced a system that does not rely on overwhelming technological superiority in a single area. Instead, it leverages coordination, integration, and timing. It turns complexity into an advantage. And in doing so, it challenges the assumptions that have guided military planning for years. The event over Lebanon is not the end of Western air power. It does not render existing systems obsolete overnight, but it does mark a turning point. It signals that the environment in which these systems operate is changing. It suggests that the margin of superiority is narrowing, and it raises the possibility that future conflicts will be shaped by a different set of rules. For now, the full implications are still unfolding. Investigations are underway. Analysts are working to reconstruct the sequence of events. Governments are assessing their options. But one thing is already clear. The moment that occurred in the skies above Lebanon has altered the conversation. It has introduced new uncertainties and forced new questions. And in the world of military strategy, those questions can be as consequential as any answer. The first fragments of confirmation did not arrive as a single clean report. They came in pieces, fragmented sensor logs, intercepted communications, partial battlefield imagery, and rapidly conflicting assessments from different intelligence channels. In the immediate aftermath of the F-35 loss over Lebanese airspace, the situation did not stabilize. It multiplied. Every new layer of analysis produced more uncertainty, not less, and that uncertainty quickly became its own strategic force. Inside Israeli command structures, the initial shock gave way to a more difficult phase interpretation. The question was no longer what happened, because that much was visually undeniable. The wreckage had already been geolocated, identified, and confirmed through multiple independent intelligence streams. The question had shifted to how it happened, and more importantly, whether it could happen again under similar conditions. That second question carried far more weight than the first. Early assessments began to converge on a troubling possibility. The engagement had not been the result of a single breakthrough system acting in isolation. Instead, it appeared to be the culmination of layered adaptations developed over time, tested incrementally, and refined through repeated exposure to Israeli air operations in the region. What looked like a sudden event was increasingly being understood as the visible peak of a much longer invisible process. Within hours, technical analysts began reconstructing the likely architecture of the system involved. It was not a traditional integrated air defense network in the classical sense. It did not behave like a unified radar grid or a centralized command and control structure. Instead, it resembled something more distributed, more adaptive, and significantly more difficult to neutralize through conventional suppression tactics. Each component of the system performed a narrow function. One set of sensors focused on low-frequency detection, not to produce precise tracking data, but to establish broad volumetric awareness of airspace anomalies. Another set monitored electromagnetic emissions, not as a primary detection method, but as a behavioral signature layer, identifying patterns in communication and navigation systems. A third layer focused on thermal differentials, particularly engine heat signatures against environmental baselines. None of these systems alone could reliably track a stealth aircraft. But together, they created a narrowing field of probability. The key innovation was not detection in the traditional sense, it was constraint. Instead of trying to locate the aircraft precisely, the system reduced uncertainty until the aircraft's possible positions became limited enough to make a high confidence engagement decision viable. This represented a fundamental shift in how air defense problems were being approached. Precision was no longer the prerequisite for lethality. Sufficiency was, once this conceptual threshold was understood, the implications became immediate and far-reaching. If such a system could be assembled in one theater, it could theoretically be replicated elsewhere. If it could be refined under sanctions and resource constraints, then it could potentially be improved under more favorable conditions. And if it had already achieved this level of effectiveness against one of the most advanced stealth platforms in existence, then the global risk calculus had changed in ways that were not yet fully measurable. Meanwhile, in Washington, the reaction was shifting from emergency assessment to institutional containment. The initial phase had been about understanding the event. The second phase was about controlling its interpretation, because in strategic environments like this, perception is not a secondary effect, it is a parallel battlefield. Within the Pentagon, one of the most urgent concerns was not simply the loss itself, but the precedent it created. The F-35 program had been designed not only as a weapons platform, but as a cornerstone of alliance interoperability. It was embedded across multiple theaters, multiple doctrines, and multiple future war plans. A confirmed vulnerability did not just affect one operational zone. It cascaded across every planning assumption built on top of it. Analysts began running scenario revisions at accelerated speed. What changed if stealth was no longer absolute under certain layer detection environments? What changed if adversaries could force probability-based targeting solutions without achieving classical radar locks? What changed if missile engagement windows could be compressed without warning emissions? Each question did not produce a single answer. It produced a range of revised doctrines, all of which pointed in the same direction, reduced operational freedom in contested airspace. At the political level, the implications were even more sensitive. Defense procurement decisions across allied nations suddenly acquired a new layer of scrutiny. Programs that had been justified on the basis of unmatched survivability now had to be reassessed in light of a demonstrated breach. Even if the event was still under analysis, the perception of vulnerability was already operational in political discourse. In Tel Aviv, the situation carried an additional dimension of urgency. The loss of an F-35 was not only a tactical setback, it was a disruption of a carefully constructed operational model. Israeli air strategy in the northern theater had been built around the assumption of controlled air dominance, not absolute immunity, but sufficient superiority to maintain operational tempo under hostile conditions. That assumption had now been challenged in the most direct way possible. The immediate operational consequence was a recalibration of air mission planning. Sorties over certain zones were suspended pending further analysis. Electronic warfare teams were redeployed to reconstruct the engagement environment. Intelligence units were tasked with identifying any prior indicators that might have been missed. But none of these measures addressed the core issue, which was uncertainty about the survivability envelope itself. What made the situation more complex was that the adversary was not static. There was strong evidence that the system involved had been evolving in parallel with Israeli operational patterns. Each previous engagement, each reconnaissance flight, each strike mission had likely contributed unintentionally to the refinement of the detection architecture. In effect, the system had been learning. This introduced a new layer of strategic discomfort. Traditional air defense suppression doctrines rely on predictable patterns, locate, jam, degrade, destroy, but a distributed adaptive system does not present a single target set. It presents a shifting network of dependencies. Disabling one node does not collapse the system. It forces reconfiguration. As these assessments circulated, a broader realization began to take hold within strategic circles. The age of platform-centric dominance was giving way to system-centric competition. In previous eras, superiority could be defined by individual assets, a fighter jet, a missile system, an aircraft carrier. But in this emerging environment, effectiveness depended less on individual platforms and more on the interaction between detection, processing, and engagement layers distributed across multiple domains. This shift had profound consequences for how military power is measured. It was no longer sufficient to evaluate an aircraft based solely on its stealth characteristics or speed or payload capacity. Its survivability depended on the ecosystem in which it operated. And that ecosystem was now contested in ways that were not fully understood. In Tehran, the strategic messaging reflected an awareness of this broader significance. The public framing of the event emphasized not just the tactical success, but the validation of a long-term doctrine centered on asymmetry, persistence, and technological adaptation under constraint. The message was carefully constructed to serve multiple audiences simultaneously. Domestically, it reinforced legitimacy. Regionally, it signaled capability. Globally, it introduced uncertainty. At the same time, operational discretion was maintained regarding technical specifics. This absence of detail was itself strategic. By withholding exact system descriptions, the ambiguity of the threat was preserved. And in strategic environments, ambiguity can be more powerful than disclosure. Across the region, allied and aligned groups interpreted the event through their own frameworks. For some, it was evidence of shifting deterrence dynamics. For others, it was validation of long-standing claims about vulnerability in Western systems. But for all actors involved, it reinforced a shared conclusion. The balance of technological confidence had become less predictable. As analysis deepened, attention increasingly turned to the broader implications for future conflict scenarios. One of the most significant concerns was geographic transferability. If a system of this nature had been successfully deployed in Lebanon, could similar architectures exist elsewhere without detection? And if so, how many operational environments were already affected? This question proved particularly sensitive for Indo-Pacific planners. The logic of stealth and long-range strike capability plays a central role in that theater's deterrence architecture. If the assumptions underpinning survivability in contested airspace were weakening, then entire contingency frameworks required revision. Back in Washington, the political system began to engage more directly. Congressional inquiries were anticipated even before formal reports were completed. Defense contractors prepared briefing materials. Allied defense ministries requested clarification channels. The institutional machinery surrounding the F-35 program shifted into defensive posture, not in the operational sense, but in the informational one. Yet, beneath all of this activity, a more fundamental shift was taking place. The psychological foundation of deterrence was being tested. For decades, certain systems had carried an implicit authority, a sense that their presence alone was sufficient to shape adversary behavior. That authority depended not only on capability, but on belief in that capability. And belief, once fractured, does not easily restore itself. What emerged from the Lebanese engagement was not a collapse of air power, but a recalibration of its meaning. Air superiority had not disappeared, but it was no longer absolute in perception. It now existed within a more contested cognitive space, where assumptions required continuous validation rather than static acceptance. In military history, such moments are rarely defined by immediate transformation. They are defined by accumulation. One event shifts perception, another adjusts doctrine, a third changes procurement priorities, and over time, the system reorganizes itself around a new set of constraints. The F-35 loss, whether ultimately understood as anomaly, breakthrough, or transition point, had initiated that process. As night gave way to the next cycle of analysis, one reality became increasingly clear across all centers of strategic assessment. The event was not closing, it was opening. It had not concluded a chapter. It had introduced a period of sustained uncertainty in which older models of predictability were no longer sufficient. And in that uncertainty, every actor involved, military, political, and strategic, was now forced to operate with a reduced margin of confidence, where each decision carried not only operational consequences, but structural implications for the future architecture of conflict itself.